Hey everybody. So we're going to look at chapter 27 here, Walking into Freedom Land, the Civil Rights Movement from 41 to 73. The Civil Rights Movement. That's what this chapter is about. The Civil Rights Movement, primarily focusing on African Americans, although we do look at a few other groups as well. Um, this is really where we see the beginning. Well, I'll actually advance one slide to here. From 41 to 57. That's really where it starts. So the period is 41 to 73. We cover this in two different parts. I mean, same chapter, but two different parts in the chapter. The first part of it, from 41 to 57, that's really where it begins. Um, it's a strange hypocrisy, irony. I'm not sure how what the word is. When the war ended, the American Civil War ended. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, but the 14th to 15th Amendments guaranteed equal rights and voting equality for all people. That should have been it. The 14th to 15th Amendment from the 1860s should have done it, given all equality and all rights to people of color, to all minorities. It did, but it didn't because people found ways around it. The wording of the amendments was just too broad, too non-specific, and many places from coast to coast found ways around to circumvent the 14th and 15th Amendments. And then you throw on top of that some different Supreme Court rulings, which really limit the effects of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Effectively, they made black people fully equal, and then through legal machinations at both the federal and the local level, they took away most of that equality. Life under this period of segregation, discrimination, uh, oppression, especially in the South, is what is known as Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow segregation. Um, and now we're going to see these movements, both political movements on the local level and changes at the federal level, are going to correct all those things. It isn't perfect, but in essence, everything that came along to restrict rights of people of color and minorities in general is reversed by the 1960s. One thing you can never change, though, is mentality, psychology. That is probably the toughest thing to change, to be honest. In the 1950s, we had about 15 million African Americans in the United States. With some southern states, almost half, 50% of the population was black. And they represented about 10% of the entire US population. All through the 19th century, southern states have been deeply divided by race and segregation. And we call this Jim Crow segregation. And it is fully legal. Uh, Based upon rulings at the courts and Supreme Court and laws passed and loopholes, none of these really violate the 14th and 15th Amendments. They find ways around it legally. These Jim Crow laws, laws that made parks, libraries, buses, restaurants, schools, hell, water fountains, bathrooms, I mean, everything was segregated, meaning separated by race, black versus white. Also, African Americans were disenfranchised for voting. They were kept from voting. We see most black people voting in really low numbers for various reasons we'll talk about. We have almost no government presence of African Americans, especially in the South. Again, this is focusing on the South right here. Very little presence of black people in government, city or state government. Employment and business work, typically the lowest sectors of cleaning, cooking, warehouse, loading, sharecropping, which is farming, well, practically slavery farming, service sector, low education, low education opportunities. Um, Less than 20% voted on normally. Less than 20% were able to vote. They realized they had no power, so they chose not to, or their vote was coerced, or uh, terrorism, between poll taxes, literacy tests, violence, other discriminatory means. So, despite the large percentage of black men and women, again, some southern states, 50% of the population in the government in those states, they're represented about 1%. Uh, they are powerless, African Americans in the South especially. It's not as bad outside of the South as we're gonna go over next. But the white supremacy and the white power and the white authority and dominance of minorities in the South is complete, and has been by the 1940s and 50s for almost a century. In the North, greater opportunities and less racism. Greater opportunities, economic power too. Make sure if I didn't say that. Powerless up here, also powerless. Almost all the money was in the hands of whites as well. So there was greater freedom in the North and the West, but not total freedom by any means. One of the biggest problems was white flight. Whites leaving the cities, going to the suburbs, leaving black people in the inner cities, which we will start to refer to as ghettos, um, leaving the poor urban blacks in inner cities with fewer resources because most resources are now being devoted to the suburb areas or industry. Northern whites often kept communities segregated through housing ordinances known as restrictive covenants. So segregation was not just in all those things I already mentioned, but also segregation in housing. Literally entire communities split. Whites on one side of the tracks, to use a saying you may have heard, blacks on the other side of the tracks. To keep housing segregated, to keep neighborhoods entirely white. This was all legal. All this was legal in this time period. Um, so whites only neighborhoods. They would sell mortgages and sell homes only to whites, not people of color, not minorities. Police harassment was common. These mortgage these which was legal at the time. These things where they would do redlining, which I'll describe later. Things like that. Mob violence, police discrimination, police harassment. So all together, the North and the West was better than the South, but it was still very discriminatory, and it was still segregation of a different type and racism very clearly. It's interesting. I think this is an interesting image right here. 1940s, I believe this takes place in the 1940s. What is he thinking? You have to wonder. First of all, buses are segregated. Black people sit at the back of the bus, whites in the front. Black people have to use a separate waiting room in the back, a rear entrance. The main entrance is whites only, and the main lobby is whites only. So only white people can sit in the nicer lobby, the bigger lobby, the cleaner lobby with the nicer bathrooms. They can only use the front entrance. Blacks can only use the back service entrance. They have their own separate waiting room, colored waiting room. Uh, that's the discussion question. You probably want to come back to this if this becomes a discussion question I use after you finish the chapter, because you may have a whole other view of what he's thinking, especially over the next sections. You might think, well, he hates this, it's terrible, it's a problem. You might want to rethink that. And so that is the question. What is he thinking? Is he thinking about segregation discrimination? Obviously, he could be thinking about anything. He could be thinking about his mom's tuna casserole. But the point is, regarding the topic we're looking at, if someone asked him about this topic of discrimination, segregation, Jim Crow legalized discrimination, all of this pressure that's being put to weaken and disenfranchise blacks, what would he think about all that? Think about that. What do you think about voting? What do you think about government? What do you think about the fact that he has to sit at the back of the bus, or he has to use a separate waiting room, or a separate bathroom, or a separate school, and that he knows full well his school has got it's not as nice as another school. It doesn't have the same services. The teachers aren't as well trained. The bathrooms are dirtier and don't work. Um, and that's just the physical stuff. That's not even the psychological stuff of how blacks are treated as inferior and second class. Um, so you have to wonder, what is life like in the 1940s for a black person who has lived under Jim Crow segregation since he was born? Since the day he was born, life has been like this. And it was this way for his parents and his grandparents. So, what does he think about it? All right, we have some Rosies. These are wartime Rosies, and this is significant. Like we're talking about World War II now again, right? Well, we actually are. We're going to talk about World War II here in a minute because World War II is influential upon this civil rights movement. These two ladies look happy. They have men's jobs. They're welding. They have jobs that normally only been done by men. But during the war, these Rosies are the women who stepped up and they started doing all these men's jobs because there were millions of men gone at war or being trained. So women stepped up and filled these positions. So these are a couple of wartime Rosies. What do they think? Same time period as this picture. So here's this guy in his situation. Here's these girls in their situation. What do these women think? What do they think about Jim Crow segregation discrimination? Now, I don't know. Your book might tell you. I don't know off the top of my head. Where are these women? Hard to know, but I would bet they're not in the South. He is in the South. Separate colored waiting rooms. He's in the southern states. The fact that they're doing an industrial job like this, probably in the Northeast. Probably. Their life is a little different. What do they think about Jim Crow segregation discrimination? How does it affect them? And again, you're going to want to go ahead and at least go ahead and go through half of this chapter, and then you're probably going to backtrack and answer that. Because I haven't really given you enough yet to maybe put together a good answer for that. Something to think about though, going forward. Their different experiences and what they think and what life is like for these men and women in the 1940s living under Jim Crow. All right, origins of the civil rights movement. Why now? Why suddenly now? All this begins after Jim Crow segregation. We didn't call it that the whole time, but effectively had been going on since the 1870s. So after almost a century, what happens? Why suddenly? NAACP has been around for almost 50 years now. NAACP was the largest organization advocating for equality and in civil rights for blacks. Why suddenly it all change now? Well, let's talk about that. First, the war had a major influence on civil rights. Major influence. The ideas of freedom from fascism and freedom from racism, often known as the Double V campaign, victory over fascism, Victory over Racism. Um, that is highly influential. Uh, Lots of increasing activism against racism and against discrimination, because I mean that's what the Germans were doing, especially to the Jews. Racism, discrimination, subjugation, hell, outright murders, um, which also happened in the U.S. Lynchings did happen, and so lots of increasing activism and interest in how a minority is being oppressed by a majority power, like the Germans versus the Jews. Increasing violence against blacks as well. We see increasing violence in the 1940s against black people. That also causes many people in the black community to start speaking up and really having a bigger voice. One of the reasons you don't say something is for fear of violence. One of the reasons you keep quiet is for fear of violence. Well, if the violence is coming at you already, you have no reason to keep quiet any longer. You're already getting subjected to pain and misery and pressure. So what do you got to lose? Speak up, say something. So that also increases activism. This also then brings increasing pressures on the government to make changes. The more and more public pressure there is, the Double V campaign, which is actually from the government, which is then sort of turned around. Uh, no, I take that back. This Double V campaign was not from the government. I apologize. This Double V campaign really helped pressure the government to fight against racism and fascism both. The government was pushing the fight against fascism, of course, against the Nazis. And then this social movement, this Double V campaign social movement, was really pushing, well, if we're going to fight the one ism, we should fight the other ism too. Which, because they're combined, fascism and racism are certainly combined. Certainly similar ways of hatred and violence against a minority. Certainly. This also results in growing concerns about communism, um, because there's a concern that communists will use racism against the U.S. They'll use accusations of racism against us. After all, we are pushing that we're fighting for equality and freedom and justice and all of that, democracy, while we are subjugating part of our own population. So some feared this would be ammunition for the communists, social propaganda ammunition for the communists to use against us. Certainly true, certainly possible. That we're not treating our own citizens fairly. How can we advertise for global democracy, freedom, and equality when we keep an entire sector of our population oppressed? So the World War had a significant effect upon this increasing pressure to make changes. Second, which was very significant as well, we now have a black middle class after World War II. It's small. I mean, it literally numbers in the thousands of people, but it's still a black middle class that has education, has money, handful of politicians here and there, ministers, teachers, trade union leaders, attorneys, really significant. We see a large increase in African American college students. There's multiple black colleges. Plus, by the 1940s and 50s, we see other mainstream colleges starting to admit black people. So we have a significantly increased number of educated, affluent blacks. It's still small compared to whites, but it still is thousands of men and women that are educated, have money, and have some positions of authority. Not a lot in the South, but certainly if you take the entire country coast to coast, it gives them finally a bit of a voice, some power that they had not had before. Well, this should actually probably be number 3. I've just never gotten around to changing it. This should actually probably be a 3 here. Impact of TV and other media. In essence, television, which is brand new, comes out in 1947 is when television is released to the public. By 1950s, millions of people have televisions. You can no longer hide racism and discrimination anymore. It's no longer some some I don't know, arbitrary is the wrong word. Abstract is the word I'm looking for. It's no longer some abstract idea that you hear about, talked about at the store, or you read in some little newspaper article. It's literally at news, 5 o'clock every night on television, and everybody's watching TV. You can't ignore it anymore. One of the biggest challenges Jim Crow segregation had was the fact that most whites simply didn't care, could ignore it. You can't anymore. If you watch television about the 1950s and 60s, everybody watches TV. If you watch television, you are going to see this every day. You can no longer ignore the way black people are being treated because it's on television. This discrimination, this racism, this violence, terrorism against blacks is so obvious now. It forces people to action. The 1957 Little Rock incident, which we'll talk more about later, where the military was actually required to be called out to keep white people from murdering black children in the streets. White people were threatening to kill these kids. Kids! 14-year-old kids are going to murder them in the streets. The military had to actually be there to save their lives, to keep them from being killed by these white middle class people that were acting like savages and animals. All because they were trying to integrate a high school. This new access to media, education, public institutions, and money, all of this gives African Americans power that they had never had before. And it puts increasing pressure on non-blacks, puts increasing pressure on the government to take action. You can't be ignored anymore. Probably the most significant of this is really media. Without the effective media and television, I personally don't believe this would have happened in this time period. I think it would have been further on. When? I don't know. But I think the advent of television is what really forced the civil rights movement, in my view. This gives them new power. That's the word down there you might not see. New power. All right. Now we look at this next section. Cold War civil rights. So this period is marked by mass migration of blacks out of the South. We see millions of black people leave the South looking for better paying jobs and simply better treatment in the North and the West of the U.S. They went to the Midwest, they went to the cities, they went to the West Coast. Combine this with the fact that in most of these areas, black people could vote equally and fairly. It isn't perfect, it's not across the board, but generally speaking, African Americans voted in way higher numbers once they got out of what had been the slave states, what had been the Deep South slave states in the previous century. Once they got up in the North and the Midwest and the West Coast, we see much greater participation in politics. It's not perfect, and there is still segregation and discrimination. It's just much better. Who did they join? The Democratic Party. The 1940s on, black people were almost exclusively with the Democratic Party. I mean, to the point that in many elections, African Americans vote 90% plus for the Democratic Party. Ever since FDR, black people have been Democrat, and almost entirely Democrat. Still is that way today. Most recent presidential election, I think African Americans voted 92% for the Democratic candidate. So it's still that way today. This does result in increased political leverage nationally because they have a party that gives them a voice to some degree, as opposed to the Republican Party, which gives them no voice. President Truman is a Democrat. Truman is the one who takes over, of course, after FDR passes away. Truman supported civil rights on moral grounds. He believed everybody should be treated equally and fairly. We know this. He truly did believe this. We know from his writings, from his conversations with people. He was racist. Just about all whites were. Even if it wasn't overt racism, It was institutional racism. It was just this general belief among whites that, oh, black people should be treated equally, but blacks are inferior. I mean, they're not quite equal to whites. So even among people who supported black rights and black equality, many of them still had this underlying belief that blacks were still not equal to whites, even if they believed they should have every opportunity and they shouldn't be treated separately or differently. They didn't believe they had to drink from a different water fountain or use a different bathroom or couldn't eat at the same lunch counter or ride on the same bus. They had an issue with that. They had no problem with that. But still, many of them were still thought blacks were perhaps that America was for whites. We still see that even among people who are for the civil rights movement. Not all, of course, but some are. So even though he understood that blacks had opportunities and should have better opportunities than they do, he simultaneously didn't really support them publicly. We're going to talk about one or two things he does, but during his time in office, he was president in office for what, 7 years or so? 7 years, over almost 8 years actually. He Over almost 8 years in office, he only does a couple of things that actually really directly support black rights. But we know behind the scenes he did a lot of things, trying to get legislation passed in Congress. What was the deal with this? Well, he still, because at this point in time, the southern states still leaned Democrat. Southern whites still mostly voted Democrat. Bottom line, he needed white votes. Bottom line, he needed white votes. In 1940s and 50s, you couldn't win Democratic elections. You could not win an election for the Democratic Party unless you got white votes. You had to get a lot of white votes. So he did use racist language at times. We think it was mostly to appease his party, the Democratic Party, which was still pretty racially tinged in the southern states. It really was. He certainly did recognize the importance of black votes, though, especially in the North and the Midwest, where the black vote was very significant. It really was. But as I said, he does a few things. He really does a few things, which are significant. He appoints a presidential committee on civil rights, which releases a report known, we call it To Secure These Rights, in 1947. Releases this report. He also then calls on, he then desegregates the military in 1948, which was a reward to the black community for their support during the war. Desegregates the military. Presidential Committee on Securing Civil Rights for African Americans. Then this report is released from this Presidential Committee on Civil Rights, and this report calls for a whole slew of changes in American society. It says, simply put, blacks are treated fairly, unequally, and are discriminated against on a daily basis across all levels of society, institutionally, culturally, politically. They are second class in every way. And he then, in 1948, once this report becomes public, he calls on Congress to institute all kinds of changes. He asks them to do all this. Again, he's not doing it through executive orders. He's saying Congress should take action. So he's putting it on Congress to do it, not himself. He still wants to get reelected, and his election is coming up. 1948 is his reelection. So he wants to get reelected. He's putting it all on Congress. Overall, he is considered to be the most aggressive president for civil rights for African Americans since the Civil War. Since Reconstruction, really. So what, 70, 80 years? Most aggressive president for civil rights for almost a century. And even then, there's still lots of things he didn't do. Lots of actions he did not take that he could have been much more public about. He could have done quite a few executive orders to make changes. He didn't do any of that because he still wanted to appease his base. And his base was largely Southern white Democrats. Truman also feared this thing which I mentioned a little while ago, like 15 minutes ago. I mentioned this idea that there was a real concern that communism, because remember, this is the Cold War. This is the Cold War. We talked all about that, the Cold War, and worried about communism and global communism and the fight between East and West and capitalism, democracy versus communism, and all of that. Understand, everything that happens in the 40s, 50s, and 60s is under the shadow of the Cold War. Nothing is in a vacuum. Nothing happens in this time period that doesn't influence or is influenced by the Cold War. Nothing. Um, so he is concerned that communists will use this against us. Communists will use this as anti-American propaganda to talk about Americans being racist and prejudiced, and we're not treating our own people fairly. How can we criticize the communists and how bad the Soviets are treating their people, or how the Soviets are oppressing Eastern Europe when we're doing the same damn thing right here to our own people? He worried about that. He thought it would really discredit the United States. Well, it did for some people, certainly did. Some people in the world did use this against us and criticize us about this. Hi. Okay. That was my puppy. I guess she just came by to say hi. Um, uh, there's even some people that compared what was happening in the U.S. to the Nazis and the Jews. Not in a sort of a positive way of fighting racism and fighting Nazism, fighting fascism. How we're going to fight racism, we're going to fight fascism, as in put a positive spin on it that we're going to defeat the Nazis, we're going to defeat racism, great. But actually, the other way of actually saying that America is like the Nazis, the way we're treating African Americans. That could be an unfair. We were not creating concentration camps. We weren't murdering millions of African Americans. I think that is certainly that's certainly a stretch. Um, the general socio-cultural atmosphere, yes. How we were disenfranchising and oppressing a minority population, 100% true. But to compare us to Nazis and the United States to the Nazis and what they did to the Jews, I think is maybe an extreme. Nonetheless, this was an extreme time. People were looking for any type of leverage they could use to get people's attention, to show and demonstrate how bad black people were being treated. This is one of the ways, comparing the American institutions and American government to Nazis. Um, this was an incredibly volatile time period. It really was. This definitely gives strength, though. This empowers civil rights leaders. Better believe it does. It empowers their arguments. It empowers their message. It forces people to listen in some respect. Some don't care. Obviously, some don't care, but many people do care. And this movement of civil rights, it does sweep the country, and it does bring a large sector of the white population on board with it that do believe that black people should have every opportunity whites do. But there's probably just as large a sector that would disagree with that. There's a reason this had gone on for almost a century. Most whites did not take action on this when they've now had generations to do it. They've had the power and they've had generations to fix these problems, and they haven't. So there's still quite a few whites that frankly don't want it to be fixed or don't care. But the civil rights movement does really create a large number of white people in power in Congress, in Washington, and in other governments across the country to actually take action. There was opponents to this, though. You better believe it. These are the folks I was just mentioning. Many people say this is communistic. It's anti-American. It's anti-American to treat everybody equally and fairly. Okay, sure. Yeah. NAACP was often criticized as being communist. Yeah. The pressure and the blowback from this, from the more and more civil rights action and activity increased, the more and more public awareness of this or public action being forced, the more resistance we see. The more resistance of white groups, of Southerners, of, well, KKK, for instance, and other groups, the more and more resistance also occurs. The backlash from the white majority, especially in the southern states, is intense, and people die. All right. Did you miss anything on this other slide, did you? Okay, good. I have to keep moving my photo around here, my little picture around. All right. African American migration during, well, I don't have a time period on here. Okay. My notes say this is from 1940s to 1970s. So from the 40s to the 70s, we see migration here of 1 million blacks here, 2 million blacks here, 2 million blacks here. So that's 5 million. So from the 40s to the 70s, we see 5 million African Americans leave what had been the slave states and go north and west all across the country. But also, you see a lot of whites too. You've got what, 2 million whites leaving as well. Because the South is still economically, socioeconomically bad. It's poor. Poorest places to live in America, poorest economy, worst jobs, still a lot of agricultural work. Many of these black people are leaving sharecropping, but sharecropping is practically a form of slavery. It's terrible. Going to the North and the Midwest looking for a better way of life, better jobs, better opportunities, better housing, more money, better opportunities for education, millions. Well, what does this lead to? We now have millions of people going to the cities, all looking for the same jobs, all looking for the same apartments, all walking on the same streets, using the same public transportation, wanting to sit and eat in the same restaurants. Combine that with in the 40s and 50s, we have like 10 million soldiers leave the military and come back to civilian life. And all of them are looking for housing and jobs. You put all this together, and it puts an incredible amount of pressure, social and racial pressure, economic pressure on the cities, which are now literally being flooded with millions of people from every direction, of every color, looking for the opportunities cities could afford. That's another reason this really occurs. You simply can't ignore it anymore. The pressure is intense. Mexican Americans and Japanese Americans are another minority group that are certainly affected by this. Texas, for instance, poll taxes often disenfranchise blacks, Mexican Americans, often disenfranchise Mexican Americans. Discriminatory practices in agriculture, manufacturing, low wages, all of these things really overly influenced and overly affected Mexican Americans from Texas all the way to California. Part of this was due to the cheap labor from across the border. That was certainly influential why a lot of this occurred. We also see barrios start to appear. Barrios are, in essence, they're a version of ghettos that apply to Latinos. They usually have the worst services, poor sanitation. Sometimes they're lacking electricity infrastructure, paved streets, sidewalks, social services, police, fire protection. These are entire communities of thousands, tens of thousands of American citizens, mostly. Even though there is a significant percentage of illegal citizens, illegal or illegal immigrants, the majority of these populations are American-born American citizens that are Mexican Americans, and they are not getting the protections. They're not getting treated as American citizens because they live in areas that have high levels of illegal immigration, and so the government typically lumps them all together. 20% of the population is illegal, so we're just going to exclude all of them. None of them are going to get access to services and protections of the law, protections of the government. We see these neighborhoods, these are definitely segregated neighborhoods. We usually refer to segregation referring to blacks. You better believe in southern states from Florida all the way over to California, we see segregation against minorities of Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Latino in general, Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese. We see this discrimination and segregation applied to other minority groups as well. Um, due in large part to these discriminations and the fact that almost half a million Mexican Americans served in World War II. We see Texas and California having new and I almost said improved. It's just new. It's not improved. It really wasn't there before at all. We see new organizations arise, trying to stand up for these largely increasing populations, and of course these disenfranchised American veterans. Many of these are veterans and their families. We see these new organizations appearing after the war. California, for instance, we have the CSO, the Community Services Organization. The Community Services Organization formed in 1948 in California um, to specifically protest segregation, to protest unfair labor practices, especially in agriculture, um, to protest the unfair working conditions, the lack of unionization, generally the entire ignoring of an entire community for all types of services and protections of the law. And in Texas, we have the American GI Forum. GI is a slang reference to a soldier, someone who had been a soldier. So the American GI Forum um, formed in Texas for the same things. Large number of veterans in Texas, Mexican American veterans. That, I mean, they're veterans for God's sake. They should receive the highest levels of protections. Not speaking this way because I was in the military, but just the war just happened. I mean, they had just literally fought the war against the greatest threat the world had never known up to this point, and saved the world for democracy. I mean, it sounds a little corny, but it sort of is what they did. I mean, Hitler had nothing less on his mind than world domination, and for many years he seemed like he was headed there. So I mean, they did this, and they fought, and they died, and they sacrificed, and now they're being shit on. Basically, they're being shit on by society and the government. So these organizations are trying to help these people, help minorities, help immigrants, help many of these people who are actually American citizens. California, an interesting case, which we just celebrated. I guess it's a celebration because it's a win. We just celebrated this court case recently, the 2018. So it would have been a 70-year, is that right? 70-year anniversary of this court case because it happened right here in California, Westminster School District in Orange County. And in this particular school district, we see 5 Mexican American fathers. They sued the school district in Westminster, California, because they believed that they were segregating their children into all Mexican schools. And these were exactly the same situations as the all black schools. Less services, poorly trained teachers, bathrooms that don't work, water fountains that don't work, poor services, playgrounds that are broken down. And anyway, they sue the government and saying this is unfair. Or they sue the school district, and it goes to the government. It goes all the way to the court systems, and they argue that's entirely unfair, and it is segregation, and it is wrong that just because they're Mexican American, and they are American, that they should have access to fewer things and fewer opportunities than whites. And they win. They win the court case. And the courts rule in this particular situation that segregation was unconstitutional. And this is a California ruling. So this doesn't affect across the whole country. But this is really significant because this is how many of the legal battles are won in the civil rights movement, by prior precedents. This is where a prior court case sets a rule that is then used to apply to later court cases. An opinion, I think, would be the right way to put it. Basically, one court case, one judge makes a decision or a jury makes a decision, and then later judges and juries and attorneys are able to use that information and say, well, you know what? Here in California, they ruled segregation was unconstitutional. So when we're looking at the same situation in Maryland, for instance, we could say, you know what? California ruled segregation is unconstitutional. So it should be unconstitutional here too. these court cases and precedents are really important, as we're going to talk about next. California, Japanese Americans in California. In the 1940s, Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, was formed. And the JACL was really mostly focused on recovering lost property due to the Japanese internment in 1940s. Remember I talked about that? When the Japanese were interred, they lost everything. Many of them lost their homes, their businesses, their cars, all their money. Their bank accounts were taken. I mean, they lost everything. Most of them never got that back. I mean, when they go back, their house, someone else lives in their house. The house was sold fair and square. They can't get the house back. I mean, it would be unfair to punish the people who bought the house, to be like, hey, that was our house 2 years ago. We want it back. Well, we purchased the house. It's our house. What are you going to do? Who's really at fault for this? Well, the government is. It's just very clearly the government's at fault for this, not the people who bought the house, not even the mortgage companies, not even the banks. The fault lies on the government for doing it in the first place. And so they're trying to sue anyone and everyone they can to get their property back for these Japanese Americans, to get their homes back, to get their businesses, their land. They don't win a lot of cases. Notoriously, it's difficult to sue and win against the government. They have the most money. They have the best lawyers. Yeah. To sue the United States government actually win is really tough. There's other people sued. It isn't just the government they sued, but they don't get most of their stuff back, bottom line. They don't. They do have a couple of successes, though. They do challenge the alien land law in California, which in essence made California had laws that there's more than one law about this, but they had laws that in essence meant if you were not a citizen, that's an alien. You're an alien. You're not a citizen. You couldn't own land. However, California, many parts of California states, many parts of the counties and regions in California, cities and counties, said that if you don't own land, you can't vote, or if you don't own land, you can't apply for citizenship. It's a crazy double-edged sword's the wrong word. It's just a crazy cycle. You can't own land unless you're a citizen, but you can't be a citizen unless you own land. What? And California did this on purpose. California was truthfully, outside of the southern slave states, California was maybe the most discriminatory state. It's weird. It's weird today when you look at it, how California is just about one of the most liberal, fair, and equitable states regarding minorities across our country. California and New York, I mean, they are about the best, or two of the best. Prior to the modern time period, prior to World War II, California was incredibly discriminatory towards minorities, especially anyone from Asia. Really bad. Yeah, it's really interesting. All right, now we are going to actually get into the civil rights movement. We're going to look at there's really two major strategies used. Two major strategies used to really focus and to break down Jim Crow segregation and discrimination across America. There is the movement of Martin Luther King Jr., the movement of the social activism that we're going to talk about, the marches, the protests, the sit-ins, all of that action and all that activity, the civil disobedience, all that. That's one of it. This is the other part. This is the legal strategy used. There's two levels. You have to change the laws. The legal strategy is a big part of that. But then you also have to change hearts and minds. Because you can change all the laws you want. Laws don't change people's minds, change their thoughts. They really had to do both. To really truly bring about civil rights action, to really truly create an atmosphere of equality for blacks, which wasn't perfect, still isn't perfect, still isn't there, but it's far better than it was. You have to change you have to change the laws, but you have to also change the psychology of it. This is the first part of the law part. These are the legal challenges to Jim Crow segregation. And we're going to talk about Thurgood Marshall, who is certainly a hero of this part of the attack. He might be the most well-known hero, just as Martin Luther King is probably the best well-known hero of the other part of the attack. Thurgood Marshall attended Howard University. He became a lawyer. Later, a judge. Then in the 60s, a Supreme Court justice, one of the 9 highest judges in the land. First black justice on the court. First black justice on the court. He was appointed by LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the one who takes over after. Spoiler alert: Kennedy's assassinated. LBJ takes over. Definitely a hero in this movement. He had a long history. This really ties back to this court precedents. Now, he wasn't involved in this case, to be clear, but the court precedents that are set by Thurgood Marshall and other lawyers like him, he's certainly not, there's many other lawyers like him, it really changes everything. He really creates this successful succession of legal court challenges against Jim Crow segregation. Discrimination as well. First, 1936. We go all the way back to 36 for this. He successfully challenges UMD, University of Maryland. He applied University of Maryland to get his law degree. They rejected him because he was black. They would not accept black people into the law program. Then he goes on to Howard, becomes a lawyer, and comes back and sues UMD and declares it is illegal discrimination, that if they allow whites, they should allow blacks. There's no legal reason why a black person shouldn't be allowed the same as a white person. And he wins the ruling. He wins it. He challenges this and he wins this no black admissions to the UMD school. Then in 1944, he challenges the all-white primary system in the South. All-white primaries, what is that? You can't keep a black person from running in a general election, which is the election most people vote in, because the law forbids that. But what you can do is, the way they get around that is by creating a preliminary election system, what is known as the primary system. The whole reason we created primary systems was to disenfranchise blacks. That was the whole reason primary systems were created. Because in the primary system, because it's not the general election, they can then only allow white people to run in that. So you have only white people running in a primary, which is technically legal because it's not the official election. And then, since only whites run in the primary, only a white person can win, which means in the general election, you can only have white people. Because both parties do primaries, a Republican primary and a Democratic primary, and they only allow white people. So only one white person wins, and then you only have 2 white people running the general election. It's a way of completely disenfranchising minorities legally. He challenges this and says it's simply a way to get around the actual fairness of the law and equal treatment of blacks, and he wins these challenges. Bear in mind, none of this is national. None of this changes the laws across the nation. All it does is affect laws for one particular school, UMD, one particular state where he challenged the white primary. I don't have the state in my notes, which state it was. Then in 1950s, he even goes further and he argues to the Supreme Court that universities could not segregate black students and white students on campus. In other words, force blacks in this place and whites here. Black classroom, white classroom. Black dorm, white dorm. Black bathroom, white bathroom. He argues that's unfair. On a university campus, everybody should have access to the same resources, white or black. And he wins that case as well. None of these change everything, but they all start building a foundation to where one victory after another says discrimination is bad, segregation is bad, the division of the races is bad, it is unfair, and each of it is a piece. And when you add all these pieces together, it eventually starts to tear apart the entire system. And he's only one of many lawyers doing this, white and black lawyers doing this. This is huge. This is really a major change. These cases, while not a single one is monumental, together they build this foundation for tearing apart all of segregation, discrimination, the legal part of it. It doesn't change people's minds, but it can start to change the laws, and it does. It does start to change the laws. This strategy used by him and the other black lawyers really is the foundation for dismantling legal segregation, Jim Crow segregation. They do it state by state, law by law. Many of these laws that they get overturned are not even in southern states. But then what they can do, because they know many of these cases are not going to win. If you're taking this case to court in Mississippi, you know most of the times the people are not going to go your way. The jury's not going to go your way. The judge is not going to go your way. You're probably going to lose. But if you try this case, say, in Texas, or you try this case, say, in New York, where there's certainly discrimination, but it is far less than, say, Mississippi, Alabama, something like that, that you can then try these cases in those places and then claim that, well, in Texas, they outlawed discrimination here. In California, they outlawed discrimination here. In Missouri, they outlawed discrimination here. So therefore, it should also apply to Mississippi. It should also apply to Alabama. It should apply everywhere. And it does work. It does eventually work. One great example is, I've given you several actually, but here's another great one, one of the most well-known one. Brown versus Board of Education, Linda Brown, Topeka, Kansas. Linda Brown was a student in Topeka, Kansas. She was forced to attend a black-only segregated school far from home. Meanwhile, literally right down the street from her home was a white elementary school. She was an elementary school student. Right down the street. And Thurgood Marshall, he argues this and argues that Brown was denied equal protection of the law under the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment requires equal protection of the law, and he says it's not fair. It's not fair. It puts undue strain on the family to try and transport her to some school miles away when there's literally one within walking distance. That's not fair. She has to pay more money. It's a more strain on the family. It's more pressure. It just isn't fair to do this. She's being denied equal protection of the law to go to this distant school. Eventually this goes to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court rules on May 17, 1954, in Linda Brown's favor, and the Supreme Court argues that yes, indeed, she is not being given the protection of the law. She's being denied it, and that furthermore, any type of separate educational facilities, segregated educational facilities, white-black schools, for instance, was inherently unequal. And then they do something which is unprecedented. They actually come back to the next year and amend their ruling, making it even stronger. And they come back in 55 and they amend the ruling and they say that not only is this bad and unequal and unfair, this segregation and discrimination, that integration, the opposite, bringing people together of different colors and races within the same institutions. Integration actually needs to proceed with all deliberate speed. Now, you have to understand, Supreme Court doesn't change laws. Supreme Court doesn't make laws. Supreme Court's real power is in nullification. It can nullify other laws and say that law is not constitutional. But it can't make new laws. It does the negative. It cannot do the positive. Well, so when it's actually saying this, is it's telling the states to change the laws. It's telling the federal government to change the laws. It's telling government in general to take action, deliberate speed. Well, what my point of saying that is, the Supreme Court only does so much. The actual governments of the states and federal have to then take action. And many southern states were not interested in taking action. Many southern states had no interest in doing anything of deliberate speed to force integration. Matter of fact, most southern states would have preferred to go the other way and backtrack it, make it even worse than it was. They had no interest in doing this. Southerners immediately resisted. I mean, we see that it's crazy. We see Southern resistance from this. We see rioting, marches in the streets. We see attacks on blacks, terrorism, number of death threats to Supreme Court justices numbered in the thousands. Hundreds of people were arrested for making death threats against Supreme Court justices, against the president, against members of Congress. It got crazy, and it continues this way for another decade. They said the government was being totalitarian, communist. The government was unfair. How in God's name, how dare you force integration on white people? How dare you make my son and daughter sit next to a black person in school? Oh my God, it's going to ruin their lives. It's crazy. I mean, it's just the mentality. The thing is, you got to understand, these people believed it. These Southern whites that fought this, they were willing to do anything. They were willing to kill. They were willing to terrorize. They were willing to do anything to uphold this white supremacy in the South. It didn't matter. That it's totally illogical and makes no sense. This was this is the way they'd been raised. They literally, from the time they were born, they were told blacks were inferior and that blacks were almost a disease on society. This is the type of language and rhetoric you hear people using this time period. People believed it. Now, it isn't like all whites believe this. No, it isn't like all Southern whites were like this. We're not saying like all Southern whites were racist and bigots and terrible people. No, but it was a large enough percentage of the population, maybe even a majority of the population, that really kept the power and kept the authority among whites. It's just the way it is. It's just the way it was. It was the culture of the South for a century. And the thing is, it wasn't a century, was it? No. Some of you are saying it was way more. It was actually the culture of the South for over 300 years. Because this goes all the way back to the slavery of the 1600s. So for 3 centuries now, even though slavery had been gone for almost a century, this culture of white supremacy and white inferiority had been all of the Southern society. It was the Southern culture. This was not going to go away easy. It wasn't going to go away easy at all. Many Southern whites were going to do anything they could to try and stop it, if at all possible. President Eisenhower, 1952. He was elected in 52. He's president for pretty much the whole 50s. He serves 8 years. Eisenhower accepted the laws. He accepted the changes. He accepted the court's decisions, but he didn't like it, and he didn't want to enact it. He wanted to take almost no action. It's not clear whether he was inherently racist at all. It doesn't seem like he was. It seemed like he was a status quo guy. He had been a general, war hero. He was Republican, but that doesn't mean it doesn't seem like he was inherently racist. The language he used didn't really seem racist, generally speaking. He just seemed to be a guy unwilling to tip the boat. He didn't want to make waves. He wanted things to just sail along peacefully and calmly. It isn't that he was anti-black or racist. He thought doing all of this was simply going to disrupt society, and he didn't want that. However, the bottom line is disruption of society needed to happen. For 100 years, we'd been dealing with status quo. Disruption had to happen. That's what needed to happen. We needed to see the boat disrupted. That was the only way anything was going to change. And Eisenhower was very resistant to that. And of course, Eisenhower also believed he had a much higher purpose. His higher purpose was the entire American population, which was 85% white. And further, his higher purpose was the Cold War. In other words, he had bigger things to deal with. Instead of people upset because they can't sit next to each other in school, he would have said, I have more concerns. I have about nuclear missiles to worry about. I have global war to worry about. I have communism, which is trying to take over the world. I have much more important things to deal with. So for a variety of reasons, Eisenhower really did not want at all to deal with the civil rights movement, even though a big chunk of it occurred under his presidency. In 1957, Eisenhower had to act. He was forced to. The integration of Little Rock High School in 1957. Little Rock 9, I think it is. I think that's the number. Do I have it in my notes? Little Rock 9, yes, Little Rock 9. This is where Little Rock High School, Central High School, which was an all-white high school, was being forced to integrate by the government, meaning they were being forced to allow black students in the school. There were 9 black students that wanted to go to school there. They tried to go there in 1957. They were told they'd be killed if they did. There were mobs of hundreds of whites standing outside the school, literally willing to attack them if they tried. So the National Guard had to be called out. This is Arkansas. The National Guard had to be called out to protect them. The thing is, the National Guard actually was controlled by the governor, and he actually called out the Guard to protect the school. In other words, the Guard were initially called out to keep the peace and to not allow the black students in. Eisenhower has to take action on this. He's forced to actually send down federal troops because his advisors tell him, you are about to see people murdered on television. That's what they told him. People are going to die in the streets over this issue, whether it's black kids or whether it's soldiers firing into a crowd. People are going to die if you don't do something. So he's forced into action. He sends down federal troops, and he does something even further. He actually nationalizes the Guard. When a president nationalizes the National Guard, they officially take it over. So one moment the Guard is basically keeping the black students out of the school, and while also trying to keep the peace. And they're now actually being forced to allow the black students in the school and to keep out the whites and to actually focus most of their attention upon the white mobs. Um, he does this to protect the students. This is the first time since Reconstruction, since the 1870s, first time in almost a century that the president has used federal power to actually protect blacks. So 80 years since the 1870s. So the first time in 80 years the president has had to use military power, military authority to specifically protect African Americans. And he didn't want to do it. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean it was against blacks. It really seems that he was more of a guy who really thought this issue was not really important. It was, but he didn't seem to think it was because he had much. Don't get me wrong, nuclear war and Cold War and the Soviets was incredibly important. But you know what? You can always find an excuse to put things off. And it was simply just another way of putting off this issue, which had now been lingering for a century since the end of Reconstruction. Someone needed to take action, and Eisenhower is forced to take some action. Um, what do we have here? We have, this gives you an idea where these court cases not. Here's the southern states, the ones where segregation, discrimination are the worst. No court cases. None. Not a single one. Okay, Virginia's got a couple, but Virginia is the border area. Virginia is probably less segregation, discrimination. Like the worst states are like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee. These are like this whole region right here is like the worst places. Yeah, so there's Melendez or Mendez, pardon me, you see that. Hirabayashi, we've mentioned Hirabayashi before. There's Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. So yeah, you can see them all across America. And many of these cases really set this precedent into the 1960s when they actually start going right down to the southern states and start really going over the laws in the southern states, the black codes, the discrimination, all the discriminatory practices. They're able to cite all these other cases over the last 20, 30 years, which really say generally segregation, discrimination is wrong. And it really creates this foundation for tearing it all apart. Really significant. Now we will talk about the one that is probably what people know mostly when they think about the civil rights movement, even though it should be noted very clearly that other part we just talked about was probably just as important, if not more important, than this. Certainly just as important. This, of course, is one most people know about, Martin Luther King and civil disobedience. Nonviolent civil disobedience. Since changing the laws alone cannot make all of the necessary changes to the South, we see people taking to the streets in a variety of manners to try and get things changed at the local level. Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks. In December of '55, a seamstress named Rosa Parks, she refused to give up her seat on a bus. This was a planned action by the NAACP, I believe, to test segregation on buses. And she was arrested as expected. They decided to do this because the previous week, a young woman, I think a young pregnant woman, had gotten on one of these buses and had been forced to get off. She'd sat in the wrong seat. And so something had occurred recently because these buses are supposed to be integrated already. Buses were supposed to be already integrated from a law dating back to the 1940s. And so technically, under the law, you were supposed to be able to sit wherever you wanted to on a bus. It wasn't supposed to be segregated any longer. And this woman was forced off the bus and she got in trouble for it, and she was a black woman. So the NAACP plans this. Rosa Parks volunteers to do it. She sits in white seats. She's told to move. She refuses to move, and she's arrested. She was not really breaking the law. although they claimed she was. Well, down the street, there's a brand new minister at a church there, the Dexter Street Baptist Church, Montgomery, Alabama. He's a minister. He's only been there around 6 months. Martin Luther King Jr. He leads a community boycott, community marches, and a boycott of the bus company to stop riding the buses. Black people were a large percentage of the bus riders. So the idea was that by boycotting the buses, not riding the buses, they would make a public statement and sort of make a statement that the buses needed black people. They needed them. And the bus company does almost go bankrupt. It loses a ton of money. Businesses downtown have to close because they lose so much business, because there's such a large black population there. Black people stop going to businesses downtown. They stop going downtown. Again, they can't take public transportation. So they have to use the handful of cars they have, and they have to walk everywhere. So it dramatically hurts the Montgomery, Alabama economy. This bus boycott, which lasts a full year. It lasts until like the following Christmas. Yeah, something like that. He leads this boycott. It lasts for about a year. People stop going to jobs, stop going to businesses, stop driving the bus, etc. Downtown Montgomery loses all kinds of business. The bus company almost goes bankrupt. The company refused to desegregate, though. They refused to do it. They would not desegregate their buses, even though it was the law. The law actually required it in this time period. Supreme Court had already determined that this was required to desegregate public transportation. And then November of 56, Supreme Court rules another ruling, a second ruling. The original one was in 47. This is a new ruling in 56. Again, striking down another policy of segregation. Again, saying it is unconstitutional to segregate on any type of public transportation. That is interstate. Interstate, meaning between states. And their argument is thus: the U.S. Constitution gives the government the right to regulate the economy. That's in the Constitution. Well, any type of travel or exchange of money that goes across state lines, because neither state can claim it, because it crosses state borders, that makes it the purview of the federal government. It is now interstate economy. So therefore, it is not the purview of those states, it's now the purview of the government. So the government has a right to say any bus that crosses a state line has to follow our rules. Technically, intrastate buses would not be affected by this, meaning a bus that only stayed inside the state and only had revenue and expenses from inside the state would not necessarily be affected by this. He rises to national recognition, becomes well known. He leads this boycott. He becomes the national face of the civil rights movement. Him and Rosa Parks, but eventually she fades away, and he becomes this symbol of the civil rights advocacy of the black community. 1957, he co-founds the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference with the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and they become the moral leadership for civil rights activism. They try to act as the moral leaders, because much of civil rights was really framed as in religious moral terms. That this was simply against God. It was unfair. It isn't treat others as you want to be treated. Goes against. Anyway, morally speaking, much of the civil rights advocacy on this part was really targeted on religion and how it was simply unfair and unjust to do this to other people. It's simply mean and cruel and all this kind of stuff. Very important, significant, because Southerners were ultra religious. So playing the religion card, if you will, was thought to certainly have been influential in this. It's not false. It's not in any way some type of a fraud. These people were very religious. They believed what they were saying, very much so. But it just so happens that using religion as part of the argument for the civil rights movement was incredibly effective in the southern states, where people were so highly religious. So for whatever, however it worked out, it certainly is influential and certainly significant. 1960s, the sit-ins. 4 black college students began to sit in at a whites-only lunch counter. Woolworth's Five and Dime. Woolworth, I don't even think they're around anymore. They were a department store in modern times. Back then, they had a department store. They had like a whole cafe and lunch counter attached to it. These 4 black students go there. They ask to be served. They're refused. Blacks are not allowed to sit at the counter. Blacks have to sit at the chairs in the back of the restaurant. They refuse. They're arrested and thrown in jail. The next day, there's more students. The next day, there's more students. Over the next couple weeks, almost every single seat, like 60 plus people, would show up, black and white. Because there's also another law, which I haven't really mentioned. Many of these places also made it illegal for blacks and whites to sit together. So not only was it illegal for blacks to sit in certain places, even if it was in the black area of the institution or the church or facility, it was illegal for whites to sit next to blacks. So they were breaking the law doubly. Birmingham, Alabama. This was, quote, the most segregated city in the United States, according to Martin Luther King. In 1963, he and others began picketing the city's department stores. They claimed segregation and discrimination in the stores. White people got the better jobs. White people got the commission jobs. A big part of being a salesperson back then was you got commissions on your sales. Only whites got commission jobs. Black people got the service, like janitorial jobs. They weren't getting commissions. Not to mention the entire store was segregated, so there was separate white-black entrances, white-black areas. So they argued, they picket. This is where you actually walk outside carrying signs outside on the sidewalk, perfectly legal. Well, they were attacked. They were attacked by the police. They were attacked by local. Make sure I get this right. Yeah, police, cattle prods, attack dogs, fire hoses. All of this was captured on TV. Again, television might be the most significant part of this whole movement. You can't ignore it anymore. It's at 5 o'clock news every night. Black people who are doing nothing illegal, simply walking on a sidewalk, asking for the department store to change its policies, are being beaten, arrested, assaulted, attacked by dogs, water hoses, electric cattle prods. I mean, it's just inhuman stuff, really, that they're doing to American citizens. They're doing stuff that's like war tactics against people who are American citizens who have broken no laws, committed no crimes. Martin Luther King was arrested along with others. This is where he writes, and eventually he releases his very famous letter from a Birmingham jail as he's serving this jail sentence for breaking the law. I don't know what he was charged with, probably something like disturbing the peace or something like that. This becomes an anthem for the civil rights movement. It was a combination of, it was a combination of Christian ideals, American Republican ideals, dating all the way back to the Revolution. The idea of that this is a Christian Republican nation. He talks about the Constitution. He frames the entire civil rights movement as a battle between good and evil. It's a battle between good and evil. And that Americans have to make a choice. Which side are you on? So I sort of alluded to that a half hour ago, and I talked about how the civil rights movement, a big part of this aspect of it, is really morality. To try and make people feel that if they're on the wrong side of this, they're on the wrong side of God. And he frames it exactly that way. This is a battle of good versus evil. You have to make a choice. You cannot stand on the sidelines. If you're a good Christian, you must support civil rights. Because God supports it. American ideals of equality and freedom support this. It's in the Constitution. All men created equal. And never in our society, up to this point in time, has that ever really been true. It hasn't happened. And he argues all of this. And that we have to make a choice. If you're going to be an American, you have to make a choice. Which side are you on? Are you good or are you evil? this affects a lot of people. This really makes a lot of people look at this differently and start thinking about this in different terms. Um, Finally, in 1963, President Kennedy comes on television and he announces he is going to push for and sign into law some type of new civil rights law, some type of new civil rights bill. He wants Congress to pass it, to write it, and he'll sign it into law. He announces this in 63. This leads us to a massive demonstration, the March on Washington. This march takes place in August of 63 to support the bill, the planned bill. It hasn't come out yet. It's to support this, what will become the Civil Rights Act. King addresses over 250,000 people, over a 250,000 people, in what's known as the Capitol Mall. It's that large area out there that is between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Monument, with the, like sort of the pool in the middle, the reflecting pool, I guess it is, in the middle of it there. He addresses the crowd. He stands in front of the Lincoln Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. This is where he gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He announces that blacks were free at last. I think he may have jumped the gun on that. This is huge. It's huge what happens eventually, the civil rights law and other laws that are passed. But I think this idea that blacks were free, I don't know. I think you could make an argument that even today, blacks still are not 100% equal in America. But it's a huge step. It's a huge step forward. It's certainly significant. Well, shortly after that, Kennedy's assassinated. He's assassinated in November, I think, November of 63. He's assassinated in Dallas. Then there's a church bombing, which kills several children. The church was empty. It was bombed. I don't know who it was bombed by, but the church was bombed and burned down. The church was empty, but I think there was a school going on in the basement, like a kindergarten or a daycare or something, and several children were burned alive. So President Johnson announces another action. President Johnson announces another action. Yeah, LBJ is now the president with Kennedy's assassination. He announces actual action on the Civil Rights Act. What Kennedy announced in 63 was very ambiguous. There's going to be a civil rights law passed. But that's really it. It's very unclear. It's vague. Vague is the word to use. Sorry, vague is the word to use. Johnson actually talks to Congress and talks to representatives in Congress, and they put something together. And he then actually comes out with an announcement of a very concrete act and actually talks about things that are going to be in the act and says he will sign it as soon as Congress passes it. And he does. Congress passes it shortly after that, and it is known as the Civil Rights Act, 1964. Probably the most important legislation since the Civil War, in 100 years, since the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Maybe the most important legislation, because 14th and 15th amendments were often overlooked and ignored. So maybe the most important legislation since the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, perhaps. Very significant, really important. Certainly for civil rights. We're talking about civil rights. Special importance was Title VII. Title VII may be one of the most important aspects of it. Title VII of this, which outlawed employment discrimination based on race, religion, and then further guaranteed equal access to schools and public accommodations for African Americans. Very specific. Any type of public accommodation, school, buses, waiting rooms, bathrooms, anything that is public, which is most things, must be accessible to both whites and blacks equally and fairly. And there can be no discrimination based upon religion or race. Because even though we're not even talking about it, there was a lot of racial tension or a lot of religious tensions in this time period too. We're seeing increasing numbers of Catholics coming in the country, and there's a lot of religious tensions over religion, Protestant versus other religions. That's also a concern. I didn't mention sex because sex is not in there initially. Sex is added later. I think it's added in the 70s. They go back and add it to it. They amend the bill and add sex protections for sex. This specifically is to say women should have equal access to any types of jobs or any types of employment, any types of opportunities. Women should have full access as men. Also, that isn't really ever been realized either. Even today, women still make less money doing the same job as a man. So certainly better than it was. Uh, in 1960, just happens. This one off the top of my head because the numbers are the same. In 1960, it was believed women made about 60% of what a man made doing the same job. Today, those numbers generally move, depending on what polling is done and what research is done, generally in the mid 80s to the low 90s. Either way, mid 80s to low 90s isn't 100. So even today in our modern society, women are still making 10 to 15% less money doing the same job as a man. So, but nonetheless, this was added to this Civil Rights Act, which said women could not be discriminated upon. Specifically, they use sex, but of course, what they're referring to is women in this time period. There's not really any issues of transgender or anything like that. That's not even I don't think that's even an issue on anyone's minds in this time period. Selma, the Voting Rights Act. The SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, calls for a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, and they want to protest the murder of an activist in 1965. Marchers were attacked by state troopers. They were promised they would be protected. Well, when they were inside the city limits, they were. But as soon as they stepped outside the city limits, they were attacked by the state troops, state police, because the state police work for the governor. And he sent the state police out there to get them. Again, claiming they were disturbing the peace, they were blocking traffic, something like that, which they probably were. They probably were doing something like that, but that's where you get arrested. That's where you don't get beaten on the streets and sent to the hospital. They were beaten. They were attacked by tear gas and dogs. Again, it was bad. It was really bad. They were clubbed. They were hit. They were beaten. Almost all of it was shown on national television. Again, the reporters were there. The cameras were there. One of the most significant important things the civil rights advocates started doing after the 40s is every time they had an action or a march or a protest or they knew there was going to be some type of activity, they would call the news stations. They would call the newspapers to make sure there were witnesses. And there were always witnesses after the 1950s. There was always a camera there, a reporter there, a newspaper person there, someone recording it, video, audio. There were always witnesses. That's hugely significant for the civil rights movement. President Johnson calls this an American tragedy. Bloody Sunday, it's often called. It's referred to as Bloody Sunday by I don't know who calls that, the media maybe? Bloody Sunday. He then goes to Congress and he asks for the passage of a new law, the Voting Rights Act. He asks for that to be passed immediately through Congress, and it is passed quickly. 1965, the Voting Rights Act is passed. The Voting Rights Act is designed to increase voting opportunities for minorities, mostly focusing on blacks, but minorities in general. To give them rights to vote, to outlaw literacy tests, and any other mechanism to basically restrict black voting. Remember literacy tests where you had to show you could read and write, you had to show you could interpret a section of the Constitution, which a lot of people can't do. Hell, I can't interpret some. Constitution's complicated. Those guys were smarter than me, or at least they wrote strange, so you couldn't really understand it. 24th Amendment was also passed. Do I have that on here? Yeah, 24th Amendment was actually passed the previous year. It was passed in 64. Amendment to the Constitution, which eliminated poll taxes, so you didn't have to pay any more to vote. This, of course, was designed to disenfranchise poor people in general, white or black. You see, the power the politicians had in the southern states over the southern states wasn't just about disenfranchising blacks. It was about disenfranchising all poor people. Black or white doesn't matter. It was all about keeping the power in the hands of the upper class whites in the southern states. So 24th Amendment passed, the Voting Rights Act passed. All this happens in the mid-60s, 64, 65. Does this have an impact? Oh, you bet it does. You bet it does. Here's a couple numbers I'll give you. 1960 to 1971, when all this is happening, the percentage of African Americans that vote triples, goes from 20 to 62%. So it triples the number of black people voting. Huge. Well, how does that translate? Because if black people vote, the idea is they're going to vote black politicians into office, right? I mean, that's the translation, right? It's going to put black people in office who can then make the laws and change policies. It does. From 1960 to 1980, that's this statistic, so a 20-year period, the number of black politicians in the United States goes from 1,500, and again, that's the whole US, most of those are probably not in the South, to 5,000. So that's over a triple increase as well. So a triple increase in voting participation and a triple increase, more than triple increase, in actual African American politicians in positions of authority across our country. Over 5,000 politicians, black politicians by 1980. For the first time in America, African Americans have power and have authority for the first time. And a lot of it is a result of this entire movement, the civil rights movement. It works. It's imperfect. There's problems, there's things that slip through the cracks, and there's places where a lot of these laws are simply not upheld appropriately. Racism still persists, prejudice still persists, bigotry still persists, but it is a huge improvement. It's really a huge change. It is a major step forward. It really is. For the last 100 years, it had been one step forward and two steps back for African Americans. This civil rights movement is really a sprint forward. It really makes a big difference. This gives you an idea of the freedom rides. It just shows you the freedom rides. Also shows you other things. Shows you the Greensboro sit-ins up here. Freedom rides. There's your Little Rock, Topeka, Kansas. The Selma, the Bloody Sunday right here. Montgomery, Alabama, with the thing with Martin Luther King. Anyway, gives you an idea what happened. So this is as far as the freedom rides got. They were supposed to make it all the way down to Louisiana, New Orleans down here. They had to stop. They had to end it because they really feared someone was going to die. You know, bad. I mean, this is an interesting example. When a couple black people climbed through the windows of the bus that was burning on fire, that they would have died inside. It was on a street. A white girl from a local home. She brought them water. A young girl. She brought water to them and gave them aid. When it all was over, that family had to move. That white family had to actually pack up and leave town. They received death threats and terrorism threats. They were told they were going to be killed, their children were going to be killed, their house was going to be burned down, their car was bombed, their car was actually attacked and set on fire. All because their little girl gave some water to a black person who had just been almost murdered. It was crazy. It was crazy. Their life was ruined in that town because of what their little girl did. Simply compassion. Simply, again, moral. Just doing the right thing. One of the reasons so many people in the South, even if they were not racist or prejudiced, didn't do the right thing was because of the backlash you would get, the violence you would get from the minority, the white minority, which were willing to do anything to maintain white supremacy. Pretty crazy. But true. Number of black registered voters. Look at the increase here. Louisiana, it doubled 2.5 times. Arkansas, 2.5 times. Texas increases, what, 50%? That's the orange to the purple. Look at Mississippi. Number of registered black voters. increases over 10 times. Georgia doubles, Alabama's triple. Look at these increases. Massive number of black voters getting registered as a result of the Voting Rights Act. They're registered, they're voting, and the number of black people participating in politics, or participating in voting, sorry, 2.1 million to 3.8 million. So in an 11-year period, we see a 50% increase in number of black people voting. Huge. Makes a huge difference. It's not like suddenly black people are running the South or anything like this. But for maybe the very first time, African Americans are actually getting their fair share of the political pie. We actually see some places in the South that have approximately appropriate representation to where the population is 20% black, where you see 20% of the local politicians are black. We see that actually start to occur by the 1980s in many southern states. We start to see black mayors elected, black congresspeople elected for the first times ever, black governors in the 1980s. It has a huge impact. It really changes lots of things. All right, another aspect of this, which isn't necessarily to do with the civil rights movement, but it's really to a backdrop to all of this, is the overall issue with poverty and violence in the country. The violence that we see during the civil rights movement and the violence we see against blacks, it's not a new thing, obviously. It's been going on forever, for centuries. But it's not even a new thing just in the context of the United States having even nothing to do with race. It's just not a new thing. Just violence and poverty in general, crime in general, are very common in urban areas and in minority areas. Very common. So this is associated with civil rights advocacy, but really it's sort of the background that's always been there. So it isn't directly associated with it. 1960s, we see all these violent protests. We see all these violent protests against civil rights advocacy. We see for civil rights advocacy. Occasionally, we do have violence for civil rights. Black Panthers, for instance, something like that. I don't really talk about that. I don't like spending time talking about violence for civil rights advocacy because I don't agree with it. So I don't really agree with pretty much anything Black Panthers did. So I don't even choose to talk about it. But your book has it. So if you're interested about it, well, if you're interested, simply Google it. But anyway, your book has the information as well. We see this Black liberation movement referred to, and this is where you're more likely to see groups like Black Panthers or Black Power movement, as I'm going to show you in a moment. It was mixed with violence, even to the point that some carried guns, like Black Panthers. They carried guns. Their argument was simple. The police have guns, they're going to shoot and kill us. Well, we're going to have guns and we're going to shoot and kill them back. It was self-defense. That was their argument. It's our right to defend ourselves from unfair violence of police. Often mixed with violence. 64, we have rioting and looting in Harlem, Watts, Detroit. Every time, 30 to 40 people dead, mostly black. Mostly it was black rioting. The white police come in and start killing and beating people. This rioting and looting, for instance, Harlem was where the cops shot a black person. Watts, which was Los Angeles, here we have the arrest of a black motorist happening again, which sets off this riot. 34 people dead in Watts, Los Angeles. Bad, really bad, really bad. There were riots in 67 alone. We had 22 riots in cities across America. Race riots. Detroit, 43 dead, almost all black. From Los Angeles to New York to Detroit to Atlanta to Washington to Baltimore, everywhere across the country. Especially by the late 60s, we actually see increasing violence. Part of that is due to the civil rights movement itself. The argument is thus, all the laws have been changed in the early 60s, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and by 67, people are saying everything should be changed. Everything should be better now. Black people should have all equality and all rights and should be treated fairly, and they're not. In many cases, many states don't really enact these policies. In many cases, the states are very slow to take action. Many states, many of these policies and laws enacted by the government don't really start to take action until the 70s. So many African Americans look around and say, well, those laws were passed 3 years ago. What the hell? Nothing's changed. Well, another facet of this, there's really three. Another facet was some people had the misguided belief that by changing these laws regarding politics and equal representation and having black politicians, suddenly life was going to get better for black people. They were going to stop all living in poverty. They were all going to be able to go to college now like whites. They were all going to have better jobs and better opportunities and better housing. No, none of that really comes about immediately or even at all in some cases. Many people felt the civil rights movement was going to change America. It was going to change everything, which the civil rights leaders are somewhat to blame for this because that's how they portrayed it. Many civil rights advocates, white or black, religious or secular, often portrayed that this rights movement would change everything. Well, many black people in 67 looked around and said, nope, nothing's changed. I still live in poor housing. The police still harass us. I still make shit at my work. As far as money, nothing's changed. So the promise of civil rights for over a decade was everything was going to change, and for many people, it didn't, or it changed very little. And this really frustrated lots of folks. And we see this backlash. And the third thing, which really causes a lot more of this violence and this rioting in the streets and a lot of black anger, animosity, and a lot of black fear and frustration, which spills out into the streets, is the war, which has now started. The American war in Vietnam. And the war has started, and now the government's coming around and grabbing up our young people and saying, you're now enlisted, go put on a uniform and go fight on the other side of the world. Eventually, we send millions of people to Vietnam. At one point, achieving almost like 600,000 people actually on the ground at one time by 1969 or so. So the whole war is also really frustrating a lot of folks because now their sons and their brothers and their fathers are going off and dying on the other side of the world for an American country, which many black people feel doesn't really even respect them or care about them. So the 1960s is sometimes referred to as the blood in the streets decade. It was tough. Um, yeah, it was really tough. The violence was condemned by the white majority and condemned by black leaders as well. Um, but it was also believed to be inevitable. It just, the promises of civil rights movement is long term. It takes decades for that to really work its way out, to where black people can actually get into political power and actually make changes. So we can have more blacks in college who then become professional, more black middle class people and upper class people. It's a slow process, and many people felt that the process should be quicker, immediate, and it's a process that really takes decades. This was inevitable. This backlash by the black community in urban areas was probably inevitable. Kerner Rights Commission was a presidential commission led by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner. It was released in 1968, a report released in 1968, this Kerner Commission report, and it states unequivocally, maybe the most important statement about the 1960s. Maybe. America was now two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. Two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. If anything, what this states is the civil rights movement was a failure. It wasn't in the long term, but in the short term, your average African American doesn't notice any difference, even though they'd been told for a decade it was going to change everything. Many of them look around and say it didn't really change anything. Poverty is common. Urban racism is common, even more, even worse, maybe. And then you throw on top of this the war, which is ramping up. From 1965 on, we're sending soldiers over to Vietnam. By 1968, we're sending over hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Uh-oh, there goes my phone. All right, I'm back. I don't know if you could even hear my phone when it went off there, but that's my wonderful wife. All right, so where are we at? It exposed racism, urban poverty, especially among African Americans. Now, bear in mind, this applies to all minority groups, as we're going to actually talk about more here in just a second. This applies to Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos. This problem with this poverty and racism is ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere, coast to coast, all states. It's primarily focused in urban areas where we see the largest amount of poverty and violence. You combine this with the fact that Martin Luther King was also killed this year. In '68, Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis. He was there as part of a sanitation workers strike, I believe. He was there to support the sanitation workers, which were primarily black. Um, he was assassinated on outside his hotel room, I believe. Robert Kennedy, who was a much stronger advocate of civil rights than probably LBJ or his brother JFK, was going to run for president or was running for president in '68. He's in Los Angeles and he's assassinated in Los Angeles. So we have the most prominent civil rights leader killed. We have the man who might be the most effective civil rights president. We don't know, but he might have been the most effective civil rights president we'd ever had because he was very outspoken about civil rights. He might have changed a lot of things, maybe. He was assassinated. We don't know if he would have won anyway, but he was running for president. I think he was running in '68. I know he was going to run for president, so I think he was planning on, or he was running. He was killed. A lot of this was very tragic. A lot of this really fractured a lot of people's hopes and dreams. The law has been passed for several years. The government's now saying things are actually worse. Our society's it's actually worse. Things are worse. Violence is worse. Unequal racism is worse. The war is happening. Hundreds of thousands of our young men and women, some women, are being taken away to go fight in war. Our leaders are being killed. '68 was a rough year for America. It really was a rough year. Well, let's go on and talk a little bit about Chicano and Native Americans. Chicano. This is a term that we usually see today we use the term Latino, but Chicano is a term which was more commonly used in the '60s, referring to the Latin American community. And I'll sort of explain how that comes about. This is our final section looking at Chicano and Africa and Native Americans. Cesar Chavez, Loris Huerta, very important figures, activists. They worked for that organization I talked about an hour ago, the Community Services Organization, which was formed in California to really advocate for equality and rights for farm workers. They were in the part of the CSO. They were looking for civil rights issues for African Americans. Together, they left the CSO and they go and become part of this. I think they actually organized it, the UFW, the United Farm Workers. And they're focusing on migrant workers, immigrant workers, which are at least half of the entire farm population. And they have no protections. At least if you're an American citizen, you have some protections. At this point in time, there's Social Security, things like this that can affect you if you're an American farm worker or citizen. But half of the entire farm production was by illegal immigrants that were here, either migrants to come and then leave, or they're here illegally. And it's really focusing on these workers, which would constantly move back and forth across all of the across our farms from Texas, really Florida, all the way over to California. They did this in 1962, organized this in '62. And their biggest focus at the time was in California. They were in California, focusing on California workers. 1968, very significant. Cesar Chavez was part of the grape workers' strike for over 2 years. He was part of this strike, which actually led to improved working conditions, pay for workers, and eventually results in the first union and unionization of farm workers in California for the grape workers. Unionization is huge. Unionization gives opportunities. It gives better pay, benefits. It gives so many things. As I said before in previous chapter, or what, 2 chapters ago, 1 chapter ago, 2 chapters ago, the way to the middle class for tens of millions of people was unions because they gave you the social safety net. This didn't suddenly elevate migrant grape workers to the level of white middle class people economically, but it was a big step. It helped many of them finally provide for their families, to keep them out of abject poverty and starvation and give them opportunities to even maybe send some of their kids to school and college. Um, it's a step. Yeah, it's a step forward. Um, and Cesar Chavez he's a hero. He really is. He's really a hero of this movement in California for Latinos or Chicanos at the time, what they called. Well, why this idea of Chicano? Well, where this idea of Chicano really comes from is, um, and I'm sort of skipping over that number 2A there. I'll come back to that 2 and 2A. The idea that Chicano was it was to replace Mexican American because previous to this, almost all people from south of the border were Mexican. Well, in this time period, we start getting large numbers of people from other South American and Central American countries. We start having large numbers of non-Mexican but yet Latin American peoples. And each one of them is going a different direction. Each one of them has their own groups and their organizations. And there's this concerted movement to replace Mexican American with the term Chicano to refer to a greater community of Latin Americans, not just those from Mexico America, to a much greater community to actually include Puerto Ricans, Cubans, to Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Colombians, to include people who are not just from Mexico, even though still the majority of people from south of the border are Mexican immigrants. And the idea is to put them all together in this group, which gives you a much stronger voice for social action. If you've got 10 separate groups and you're divided, each one has a much less of a voice and much less authority. You put all together into one single group, and you have much more strength. You have a much stronger voice. You have a much bigger population behind you. And hopefully to advocate for greater policies that will affect the entire group. Because many of the same issues were all of these poor living conditions, living in these ghettos or these barrios, often poor pay, part-time jobs, have to worry about constant deportations, lots of other issues. So all have sort of a united voice. The Mexican American Political Organization is created. That's MAPA, Mexican American Political Organization. Really focused on Spanish language in schools. The fact of basically today we use the term ESL because you have so many immigrants coming in and their children don't speak English. And there's a real strong belief that the fact that they don't speak English is a weakness because they can't participate in American society if they don't speak English. So the idea is these is really the beginning of what we call ESL schools, to where we take people who are foreigners, specifically here, Chicanos, and put them in a school where they can speak their native language while simultaneously learning English. Because many of them would go to schools where they only taught in English and they didn't even speak English. How do you succeed? You don't. You fail. From day one, you've already failed. You don't speak the language. You can't read the books. And the argument for many whites was, hey, you're here, you should know how to read. You should know how to speak English. If you don't know how to speak English, read English, don't come here. So this argument was the counter to that, to where we want to push for this training in school so they can allow these kids to transition from non-English speaking to English speaking so they can be successful. They can have jobs. They can go to college, things like this. Also, MAPA was really focused on voter registration. Again, if you don't get Latinos or Chicanos registered to vote, you're never going to elect Chicanos to office. And then, of course, getting them elected to office. Get Chicanos elected into political office. Same way African Americans are worried about that. And then the last thing I'll mention is legal defense. It was common for Mexican American people, American citizens, to get deported back across the border because they looked like they looked like they all looked the same, so they send them back across the border. They don't care to ask whether they're American citizens. If they look Latino, they're gone, and they would simply deport them, regardless of whether they were American citizens. They didn't even care. So many of them would lose their property, lose their homes, lose their jobs. They could lose their car. They could lose everything. So legal defense was to help them get back in the country, to help them get their property back, to help them in immigration cases, all kinds of stuff. All kinds of things to try and help them become American and get the full advantage of American society, not being treated so much as outsiders. And then the last thing is Native Americans. The American Indian Movement, as it was called at the time. In 1960, there were almost 1 million Native Americans in the U.S. Entirely disunited. Dozens of different tribes, dozens of different groups, different organizations. There starts to become a concerted effort to bring them together. Because again, if there's 10 different groups, each one is small and weak and has limited resources. If you could bring all the tribes together under one united authority, one united organization, instead of having 500 people here and 500 people here, you now have almost 1 million people speaking with the same voice. And so there's a real movement to bring all Native Americans, not to make one tribe, not to bring them all into one tribe, but to bring them together politically and socially, to unite them together. Unemployment was really high. Unemployment, 10 times higher than national average. Education, they were almost 50% illiterate. Alcohol abuse, substance abuse, 10 times higher than national average. They were, very simply, the most disadvantaged and underrepresented group in the United States, more so than any other group we've talked about. They were the most disenfranchised group in the U.S. Incredibly ironic when you consider they are the only real Americans. They're the only real Americans, and yet they have literally zero power or opportunity in our country. Housing, worst housing in our country. Bad across the board. There's really nothing positive. There's nothing good you can say about the status of Native Americans. They have they're the bottom of everything. And so there's a movement by Native Americans and other outside groups to try and help them, to try and elevate their status, to try and do this. Highest cases of disease and illness as well per capita. The National Indian Youth Council was formed with this slogan, for a greater Indian America. As again, bring them all together under one ethnic group of Indian. Even though there's dozens of tribes, if they could speak with one voice, they would have a lot more power, a lot more political power. There's actually some success with this. There is. So this National Indian Youth Council, it was the handful of youth and, of course, Indian college students. There was a handful of college students. They want to bring themselves as one ethnic group. They want to really find a way to work towards common goals for all Native Americans, to fight against unemployment issues and education and alcoholism and housing abuse, to really give greater opportunities. They do have some successes. We see some Native American tribes get fully sovereign status, to where they're, okay, I guess they're technically semi-sovereign, to where they have total control over their lands. They don't have to pay taxes. Some of them form their own governments, actually have their own president, their own Congress. Some of the larger tribes, they get almost total autonomy. They can choose to participate in the United States society, but they can also choose to basically opt out of everything. Our laws, our taxes, government service, military, they can generally opt out of almost everything if they want to. This is sort of a reward, I guess, for how we had treated them. Generally speaking, we come to treat, by the 1970s and 80s, Native Americans as almost independent, sovereign, little mini countries within our larger U.S. So we have the United States, and we have dozens of little semi-sovereign nations within our country. Now, this has started years earlier, all the way back in the 1930s. But by the 1970s and 80s, it really becomes pretty standard. So most Native American tribes now control their own destiny. That doesn't fix things, doesn't turn things around, because they still have very limited resources and money. So they're often still one of the most impoverished groups, unfortunately. But it's an improvement. It is an improvement for them. It's a step forward. And then the last thing we'll talk about is IAT here, the Indians of all tribes. The Indians of all tribes is sort of a red power. It's the red power version of the black power, like the Black Panthers. They're a militant branch of the American Indian movement. The IAT embrace red power, sometimes violently. They would arm themselves, very similar to Black Panthers. They believe the violence and oppression against them, they have to respond with their own violence. An example, they occupied Alcatraz. They actually took over Alcatraz, which is in San Francisco. They took it over. This was right after it was decommissioned as a prison, I believe. They demand to purchase the prison for $24 in glass beads and red cloth. What? $24 in glass beads and red cloth. They cite an argument that an island had been purchased from the Indians centuries ago for $24 in glass beads and red cloth. What do you think that was? Some little island back on the East Coast purchased for $24 in glass beads and red cloth. Probably the most expensive land in America today. Manhattan. Manhattan. Where you can buy a parking space for $1 million. Yeah. Of course they don't want the $24. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of saying you have taken everything from us for literally nothing. All American prosperity and power and authority and wealth, the most prosperous, affluent nation on earth, you took all of this from us. This was all ours before you ever showed up. You built it all on our loss, basically. Your gain is our loss. And they're simply trying to make this social statement that to get attention and brought to this, to get attention brought to the issues of Native Americans. That Native Americans, everything we have here, we took from them. It is really true. The American prosperity and the power and status of our country was really built on the pain and misery and the blood and violence of against minorities, whether it be Mexican Americans, like the Latinos, whether it be Native Americans, whether it be African Americans, slaves. It's just something we have to recognize. No, nothing's ever going to go back. We can't ever fix slavery. Slavery's done. It happened. There's nothing that can ever change that. We can't go back and give the land back to the Indians. That's not going to happen. But we need to be at least cognizant of the fact that American prosperity is built on blood and violence, often against minorities and on minorities. We simply have to accept that and recognize that, and find ways to give that fair treatment, to give that actual. I don't know. I guess I don't know what else to say about it. You have to be aware of it. You have to be aware of it, and you have to understand what American prosperity is really built on. You have to give it consideration, I guess. Thank you very much for going through this with me, and that is the end of the chapter. We are done with this, and we'll talk later.